мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции. Ее цель – защита людей, которые на протяжении 8 лет подвергаются издевательствам, геноциду со стороны киевского режима. И для этого мы будем стремиться к демилитаризации и денацификации Украины. А также преданию суду тех, кто совершил многочисленные кровавые преступления против мирных жителей, в том числе и граждан Российской Федерации.
Точно знаем, нам не нужна война, ни холодная, ни горячая, ни гибридная. Но если на нас будут наступать войска, если у нас попытаются отнять нашу страну, нашу свободу, наши жизни, жизни наших детей, мы будем защищаться. Не наступать, защищаться. Наступая, вы будете видеть наши лица. Не наши спины, наши лица.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My colleague and I shall try to document and recall the Russo-Ukrainian War.
This will include from the reasons and causes to the war, up to the current events revolving in and around the war itself.
Without further ado, let us begin.
But where do we begin? Russia has a giant amount of history.
It will be best to look at a history that pertains to modern-day Ukraine. Therefore, it might be best to talk about the USSR.
Ah yes, the communist superpower of World War II and the Cold War. What history of Russia would be incomplete without its scary red past? The force that single-handedly pushed back the Nazis on the Eastern Front, the country that united, formed the Eastern Bloc, and that made the USA forces stalemate for years on end, only to turn into history in the late 20th century.
USSR's collapse caused an entire economic and political shifts near Eastern Europe, so it isn't exactly the best force to be reckoned with.
That is true, but how did someone like the USSR collapse? I suppose it is important to the Russo-Ukrainian War somehow?
It is, my friend, for it details many events and reasons behind Russia's modern choices against Ukraine. From the end of World War II in 1945 till its dissolution on 25th December 1991, the Soviet Union was the largest country in the world.
And I thought Russia was already big enough as is. Didn't they only have 90 million citizens?
It did. The USSR only had a maximum of 290 million people from 100 different nationalities.
Then what part of its history should we consider as important?
Ukraine was a part of the USSR, just like the other Eastern European, Baltic and Central Asian states.
So wouldn't talking about its collapse be a better idea? You know, Gorbachev and his democratic style of ruling?
With that said, yes, Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985 is generally considered the beginning of the fall of the USSR, with his democratizing ideals and goals to improve the economy.
So, talking about Gorbachev and his plans is your idea? Why not also mention his struggles? Sure, the man had some good plans that he set forth in 1986 and 1987, like the Perestroika, with the aim of improving the economy, moving away from central planning and developing market enterprise, and also the policy of Glasnost, where its goal revolving around democratization of the political system, transparency of the management system, and the individual freedom of citizens. But he had many hindrances from his own citizens, independence and all.
Ah yes, the call for independence from regions and former countries to become republics, and the economic setback of the USSR. Those are indeed major hindrances in Gorbachev's plan for a democratic USSR.
Was Gorbachev's desire for a democratic USSR the primary cause of the Cold War's end? It sounds strange to me how most citizens agreed with this.
When most of the citizens starved from famine and their food was taken away in the USSR. Having the food taken, it pushed several countries to declare independence between 1990 and 1991.
But what about May 17, 1991 referendum? Many people still argue about the events that transpired that day and how legitimate the vote was.
It said 77.85% voted to perceive the USSR as a renewed federation of republics, but opinions differ. Some believe the majority supported the USSR, while others think its collapse was inevitable.
Was there a plan for the USSR in Spur's invasion?
It was planned for August 20, 1991, but reactionaries blocked Gorbachev in Crimea on August 18, leading to a failed coup.
Какими бы причинами не оправдывалось это отстранение, мы имеем дело с правым реакционным антиконституционным переворотом.
Where the next day tanks entered Moscow. The State Committee for the State of Emergency, headed by Yanaev, assumes power. Coup failed on August 21, 1991. Oh yeah, I told all this many times during history class.
That is not all. The next day, Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but his political influence had been shaken. According to a majority, Yeltsin becomes the leader of the democratic forces.
So, the Soviet republics declared independence within a year, Gorbachev resigns, and Yeltsin took over. That's the history, isn't it?
Correct. The USSR's collapse severed ties between former republics, limiting economic maneuvering in Russia and other post-Soviet states, causing an economic crisis.
Collapse also impacted the global political spectrum. The world became less stable, affecting the balance of power. Despite USSR's fall reduced the threat of the World War, it increased the likelihood of local conflicts.
Some people chalk it up to Gorbachev's quick action, and others see it as an inevitability. But we can mostly see this issue in civil war in Georgia, armed conflict in Transnistria, and civil war in Tajikistan.
If the USA themselves did not like the outcome of the collapse of the USSR, then why bother accepting it?
Because after the collapse of the USSR, its influence as now Russia started to decrease drastically. The ability to defend its interests has sharply fallen. Russia was gradually losing its sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space.
But how did our dear modern leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin, think of this collapse? What about the Ukrainians' point of view?
Vladimir Putin saw it as a catastrophe of Russia, a decay of their influence in the world. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, saw the collapse as liberation.
That means that Ukraine and Russia were already at odds with each other since the collapse of the USSR. An important reason.
To understand how Russia became so aggressive, we must look at both sides of the Russo-Ukrainian conflict from the 1990s until the 2000s.
Can we skip over Boris Yeltsin then?
No, my friend. Yeltsin is very important because without his role as president of the Russian Federation right after the collapse of the USSR, Russia would not be as economically stable as it is now.
Economically stable, it still has issues with inflation, a weak legal system, underdevelopment of modern economic activities, technological backwardness, and lower living standards. I call that less than economically stable, more like economically afloat.
It's true that Russia has many issues in their socio-economic backgrounds, but that does not mean it isn't much better than it was during the USSR days. In 1992, the first year of economic reform, retail prices in Russia increased by 2.52%. By 1993, the annual rate had declined to 240%, while in 1994, the inflation rate had improved to 224%.
Yeah, but what about the privatization of property? In the Soviet era, all enterprises belonged to the state and were supposed to be equally owned among all citizens. Privatization transfers much of this wealth into the hands of a few, making them immensely rich. Stocks of the state-owned enterprises were issued, and these new publicly traded companies were quickly handed to the members of the nomenklatura or non-criminal bosses. What's more is that under the government's cover, outrageous financial manipulations were performed that enriched a narrow group of individuals at key positions of the business and government mafia.
This did, in fact, make corruption more apparent. However, it did not hinder the economic growth and the end of mass famine. There was an economic depression during the mid-1996, 4.5 years after the launching of Russia's post-Soviet economic reform. The Russian economy has passed through a long and wrenching depression. Much of the decline in production has occurred in the military-industrial complex and other heavy industries that benefited most from the economic priorities of Soviet planners, but have much less robust demand in a free market.
So, the depression did not hit the free market as much as it did the US? How interesting. Who knew that charging one's economy could lead to such a drastic change in the economic impact during a depression?
In the early 1990s, Russia, under the leadership of former Minister of Foreign Affairs Andrei Kozyrov, expressed interest in joining NATO and advocated for a strategic partnership with the West based on shared values and multilateral institutions.
Didn't Kozyrov view the USA as a central global power and envisioned a soft unipolarity where American leadership would be balanced by institutional filters and constraints? Hardly a good example of the aggressive Russian nature we see today.
While all of that did happen, by 1993, pro-Western policies began to decline due to issues like the war in Yugoslavia and NATO expansion, leading to calls for a more independent foreign policy.
So, global cooperation fell through the net. What a waste, I say.
Not at all, my friend. Critics, including President Yeltsin himself, criticized Kazyrov's diplomacy, culminating in his resignation in 1996.
That would not be all. For his successor, Yevgeny Primakov advocated for a multipolar foreign policy philosophy, challenging NATO expansion and emphasizing Russia's ability to consolidate power in the post-Soviet era. Not many wanted to join NATO, and wanted instead to consolidate their power through the post-Soviet states, a clear sign of aggression and power hungriness, in my book.
Does your book also include Ukraine and what they were doing in all of this?
Those chapters are blank at the moment, so I hope you would be able to fill those in for me, pretty please.
Let's begin with Ukraine's independence in 1991. Ukraine's parliament declares independence, supported by 92% of voters in a national referendum. In 1994, Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons in exchange for a Russian vow to respect its borders and became a major recipient of US foreign aid. And then we have June 28, 1996. The Ukrainian parliament ratifies a new constitution allowing free speech, private property ownership, and making Ukrainian the sole state language. Lastly, on July 9, 1997, Ukraine deepens its partnership with NATO. Kuchma meets NATO leaders in Madrid to establish a distinctive partnership. Despite this support and peace, is strange considering the Chechen War started in The Second Chechen War began in late 1999 as a result of a series of complex political, economic and ethnic problems that characterized the region. It had roots in the conflict that began in 1994 when Chechen separatists declared the independence of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria from Russia.
Not just that, but also, the Chechen Republic faced serious economic difficulties after the collapse of the Soviet Union, religious and ideological differences. Most Chechens were Muslim, and in many regions of Russian anti-Chechen sentiment was expressed. Political leaders in both Russia and Chechnya sought to strengthen their power, and last but not least, terrorism, where building bombings in Russia, such as the Moscow bombings in 1999, have increased negative perceptions of Chechens. Yeah, plenty of reasons to start a war if you ask me.
To proceed with your fact, in August 1999, Russian troops launched an invasion of Chechnya under the pretext of fighting terrorism and in response to a series of building bombings in Russia for which Chechen separatists were blamed. This led to the outbreak of hostilities and the offensive of Russian troops in Chechnya. As a result of intense fighting in 1999 and 2000, Grozny and other large cities of Chechnya were heavily destroyed. The fighting took place in city streets, which led to many casualties among military personnel and civilians.
That, along with many, and I mean many, human rights violations, torture methods, and disappearances of both Russian and Chechen troops, led to a not so little amount of death among the area.
In the next years, Russian troops gradually increased control over most of Chechnya. However, separatist rebels continued to wage guerrilla warfare and commit terrorist acts.
Never give up the fight, even when you know you have lost. To carry where you left off. The major fighting ended by 2002, but reconstruction and resolution of the conflict took years, and separatists continued to carry on out attacks and assaults well into the late 2000s.
The results were dramatic and drastic to the Russians. The conflict led to changes in the political structure of Chechnya in Russia. The Chechen Republic remains part of the Russian Federation but has significant autonomy. Power in the region has been partially transferred to local Chechen authorities.
To add on to that, significant military and police forces were sent to the region to maintain stability by Russia. The Chechens did not get the exact independence, but they got one as close as they could get it.
Beyond that, Chechnya continues to face tensions and incidents of violence. Some militant and terrorist groups continue to operate in the region, even if it is less than during the war.
And beyond that, the work is underway in Chechnya to restore the destroyed infrastructure, social services and the economy, all of which was destroyed or heavily damaged during the Chechen War.
Do not forget the mentioning of the impact it had on Russia.
Ah yes, how could I forget the Big Bear himself? The Chechen War put emphasis on federalism within Russia and sparked talks about the limits of power of the central government over the regions. This led to the strengthening of the federal level of power and the revision of relations between center and regions.
Overall, the Chechen War showcased Russia's intentions with foreign policy and how it will treat post-Soviet Union nations that want to gain their independence.
Speaking of which, what was Ukraine doing during this time? It must have been something important, right?
Very much so. From September to November 2000, protests began over the Donbas scandal.
Oh yeah, the one where on September 16th, Heroi Gongadze, a Ukrainian journalist, investigated alleged corruption on the Kuchma administration. Disappears. Wasn't his beheaded body found 2 months later in a forest outside of Kiev? Not exactly the happiest way to find a missing person.
What's more is that the audio recordings were eventually found which intend to show Kuchma ordering subordinates to kill Gongadze. The scandal becomes public about corruption among Ukraine's elites, leading to street protests.
Which, in the end, led to the Western countries reconsidering the support of Kuchma's government, a necessary thing that leads us to a big part of Ukraine's history, the Revolution of Orange, or the Orange Revolution of 2004.
During this revolution, the round of presidential elections between Viktor Yushchenko and Viktor Yanukovych was called.
Originally, it was in Viktor Yanukovych's favor, but they said the election fraud was the cause of the mass protests.
Yanukovych was in lead by 2.5% when the official results came in. However, in the region of Donbas, from where Yanukovych held, voter turnout suddenly jumped, differing drastically from what exit polls had recorded.
Independent election monitors began sounding alarms about widespread election fraud and voter tampering that led to the Orange Revolt in Kiev and Maidan.
Thousands rallied against the corruption of the elections and the government in Kiev. Maidan was the tent in the center of it all, being a beacon for the revolution.
The most interesting part is that the revolution wasn't violent at all. People were orange and protested. The police got involved but never used force under Kuchma's orders. And the Supreme Court ruled that the election was null and that the re-election would be done.
Don't forget that Yanukovych and his circle are tied to the Russian political and criminal groups, and they were well known.
Yes, that means that Yushchenko, who was seen as a beacon of hope by many Ukrainians, faced constant political harassment and that they would try to rig the elections again.
Yushchenko was almost killed on September 6, 2004, when he became severely ill and suffered scarring on his face. It was later revealed that he had suffered from dioxin poisoning.
In the end, Yushchenko's ultimate victory and inauguration following January concluded the revolution, cutting off the final grip Russia had to Ukraine in the form of politics.
Putin's policy would reflect that.
We talked about Russia before, during and after its collapse. We talked about Ukraine and what happened during the collapse of the USSR and during the Orange Revolution. Are we ready now to talk about Vladimir Putin?
I believe you should, for he is the now current leader of Russia.
Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, former KGB member of the USSR. That is quite a backstory to have before going into politics.
Putin came to be the president of Russia in 2000. His political ideas were deemed to be very extreme in the nationalistic sense.
The very moment Russia had become less dependent on Western powers for economic and resource purpose, Putin had already changed and outright ignored a lot of the policies that the Western countries used, deemed unnecessary, he says.
Under Putin, Russia increasingly positioned itself in opposition to US hegemony, resulting in a confrontational foreign policy stance.
Don't forget, he convinced the Duma to ratify START II in April 2000. Subsequent events worsened US and Russia relations.
Yes, the 9/11 attacks made the worst impact, where the US withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty. This move was seen by Russia as a bid by the US to bolster its military supremacy at the expense of global security.
And therefore, Russia decided to draw out its nuclear weapons and diminish the START II treaty. And he did it, a silk and ice scenario. Never knew it could reach the level of countries.
Nevertheless, here we are weeks later. The United States' intention to attack Iraq became clear and Putin faced a choice. Either remain neutral, implicitly supporting the Americans, or side with all Europe in protesting the US-led Iraq invasion.
Good old Putin decided for the latter during his visit to Paris in February 2003. A bold move, I say. He and President Chirac officially announced their intention to block the US draft of a new UN resolution authorizing the war in Iraq.
Russia's alignment with the global war on terror served its interests, providing a justification for its actions in Chechnya.
Yet it is also true that while Russia supported NATO's operations in Afghanistan, it refrained from sending its own troops. What's more is that it replaced its troops in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan to counterbalance American influence in Central Asia. Hardly an idea of peacekeeping.
Furthermore, Russia continued its arms trade partnerships with Iran and Syria despite US accusations of supporting terrorism. Russia's refusal to support sanctions against Iran and its involvement in projects like the nuclear plant in Bushehr further strained its relations with the United States.
Yes, and let us not forget that Ukraine is the opposite fashion compared to Russia. It enjoyed and won a better relationship with the USA and Western nations, which further split Ukraine and Russia into opposite ideologies.
Asia is not the only region where Russia's influence reached. In Latin America, Russia sought to diversify its foreign policy by cultivating ties with Venezuela under President Hugo Chavez.
Additionally, Russia prioritized partnerships with India, China, and Brazil, all of which aren't a fan favorite of the Western world. This proves how much Russia is able to cooperate with its other nations, but simply refuses to do so with the USA for nationalistic reasons.
Don't come to conclusions yet. We need to state all the information up until the start of the Russo-Georgian War until we can make such conclusions.
Not much is different though, but I have to agree with your ideas. Just this once.
It's worth noting that Russia primarily communicates the concept of democratic multipolarity with countries like China, Belarus, Iran, Venezuela, India and Cuba.
Democratic multipolarity, you mean the idea that a multiplicity of sovereign states, regardless of their political regimes, would rule parts of the world? How ironic. Talking about democracy with least democratic nations in the modern age.
The Kremlin's concept of multipolarity has faced criticism from many Russian experts who argue that it may foster conflicts among competing poles, thus leading to further destabilization of international society.
With the conflicts happening in the Middle East, strengthening of Iraq, and advancement by China and North Korea, I believe that is the case.
That is one aspect of Russia, but you also need to realize that Russia is a regional power and an energy superpower.
What do you mean by regional and energy superpower?
Since the start of Putin's presidency, Russia has redirected its attention to the CIS region, designing the post-Soviet space as a sphere of special interest.
Yes, that would be the deepening of economic and security integration with CIS states within the framework of existing institutions like the CIS and the Collective Security Treaty Organization. What of it?
Energy transportation emerged as a key area of cooperation between Russia and its eastern neighbors. Russia gives countries like Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan gas and oil, and Russia gets more influence in those regions.
Oh, so that is why they call them an energy superpower. That makes more sense. But what about the Rose Revolution in Georgia 2003 and the Orange Revolution in 2004? Would not those be the first real setback of the Russian influence?
That is quite true actually. Russian influence on its post-Soviet countries and regions was pushed back when pro-West politicians were elected as presidents of their respective nations. The Russians call it a US-led Western interference in the Georgian and Ukrainian presidential elections.
And their attempt at influencing the elections itself did not turn out well in the end. Talk about being a hypocrite.
That is why they reinforced their anti-West rhetoric in Moscow, making the relationship with Ukraine in the future more complicated than that it should have been.
Wait. Are we going to skip over the Georgian War? Just like that?
No, but first we should finish talking up to the presidency of Dmitry Medvedev before we dive into that.
So, until 2009? Seems reasonable. Carry on, dear historian, for the documentation of this video.
As I was saying, regarding Ukraine, discord between Moscow and Kyiv centered on Russian gas transit to Europe and the Russian naval presence in Crimea. They were disputing about the naval base in Sevastopol.
The one where Russia has military influence and is also leasing from the Ukrainians, right?
The same one. And the Ukrainians refused to renew the lease that would end in 2017. Furthermore, they started having issues about the gas prices in Ukraine from 2005 until 2009.
The reason being that Russia made all gas prices equal in all neighboring countries. But it also means that a lot of countries will have much higher gas prices than that their currency is actually being valued at. A big economic issue overlooked by the Russian Economics Department.
It led to Russia cutting off gas supplies to Ukraine in January 2006 to recover a debt owed by Ukraine to Gazprom. In response, Ukraine withheld some Russian gas destined for Europe. This action was repeated in 2007, 2008 and 2009, disrupting gas supplies to European consumers.
But in 2009, Putin negotiated with Ukrainian counterpart Yulia Tymoshenko, leading and reaching gas prices that would be accepted by both parties. Still, that leaves us with Russia pissing off most of the neighboring countries just for the sake of power, meaning they weren't in it for the peaceful reasons, right?
We can see that being the case with all the conflict happening, but we need to explain in detail to show to the world how Russia's policies and actions led to the Ukrainian war.
Before that, don't we have to mention the president of 2008-2009, Dmitry Medvedev? He's just as important to this as Putin, you know?
If you say so, then I will let you handle this one.
Alright, let us begin then. Putin had done everything during his presidency in order to distance themselves from the international world, as can be seen with their independent economic structuring and their radical ideas on their foreign policy.
So where does Dmitry fit in all of this then?
Our dear Dmitry wanted to do the opposite, actually. He wanted to come back into Russia, into the international world. And try it he did. Dmitry Medvedev's foreign policy centers on Russia's integration into the international community, while maintaining a pragmatic approach based on the pursuit of Russia's national interest. Dmitry Medvedev's foreign policy, approved in July 2008, and the Russian National Security Strategy until 2020, released in May 2009. Both of these documents were there to replace the old lines of Putin's policy, not by changing everything in it, mind you, but by emphasizing Moscow's efforts to establish a world order based on collective decision-making, security, indivisibility, and the primacy of international law.
I recall that the documents did not change much from the foreign policy that Putin made, so what did change in that department?
Mostly the international policy Russia had, and to be more precise, Russia's portrayal as a fully fledged and influenced international actor. Dmitry did not lie and fully state that Russia's interests are not given due to consideration in the international arena relative to its actual potential, showing the world the true strength of Russia. That is all.
Is that all that Dmitry did?
All the significant parts pertaining to our documentation, that is. Which moves us to my favorite part, the Georgian War. Take lead, if you may.
The armed conflict between Russia and Georgia in August 2008 triggered by Moscow's intervention in Georgia to protect South Ossetia after an armed attack, emerged as a pivotal issue in Russia's discussions with the EU, the United States, and NATO regarding defense.
It all happened due to Georgia's increased demands for the withdrawal of Russian peacekeeping corps from South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Russia has had those there since 1991 and 1992 and served no other purpose there other than to be a foothold in Georgia's territory.
No presumptions, remember. It was originally placed there because of the South Ossetian and Abkhazian governments appealing to Russia for protection, leading to Russia mediating a ceasefire. As a result of the Sochi peace agreement, Russia established a peacekeeping mission in these republics.
However, seeing as Georgia had wanted to distance itself from Russia ever since, there's likely reason to believe that Russia's actions now are for another motive rather than peacekeeping.
That can be proven with 2005-2006 when Moscow claimed Chechen rebels were hiding in Georgian territory.
That was proven to be false when Georgia arrested 5 Russian officers on spying charges in September 2006. Then after that imposed visa requirements on Russian peacekeepers in Abkhazia. This led to the strained relationship they have now, and is also the reason why the Georgian War was that easy to start.
It all began on August 7 when Georgia launched a military operation in South Ossetia aiming to regain control over the region.
Both the South Ossetian army and the Georgian army had been at each other's throats before this, claiming that each side violated either ceasefires or provocations. So it makes sense that the bullet was bitten by someone at some point. Furthermore, Georgia was able to take over the capital of South Ossetia, Tskhinvali, the same day.
Russia came in on the 8th of August to aid the Russian citizens inside South Ossetia and keep those citizens safe.
However, on August 9 to 11, the true reason for Russia's mobilization came to light. The Georgian army was being pushed back, with the Georgian army being pushed out of Tskhinvali. However, again, the fighting spread to Abkhazia, and Russia even went as far as to bomb certain parts of Georgia with air support.
It is not the best way to protect Russian citizens, and the UN agreed to that statement. Under international pressure, particularly from France, which held the EU presidency at the time, a ceasefire agreement was reached. The document was signed by Georgia, Russia, and the separatist regions.
Russia gradually pulled out their troops, but kept their units in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. This resulted in Georgia losing its precious South Ossetia and Abkhazia in the process.
This also led to the West supporting Georgia more, so any other attempt at taking post-Soviet regions in Georgia will be in vain.
Do you believe that was their thought process when entering Ukraine? Help out the region and take some land in the middle of chaos? Seems like a plan with many risks.
It could be very well be the case that was what Russia had planned. However, Putin's policy after 2016 will show us a lot more about his plans than the Georgian War would.
Speaking of, Putin maintained a firm stance on Russia's policy objectives, emphasizing the importance of protecting Russia's national interests on the global stage. In layman's terms, take whatever Russia deemed to be theirs and do it with pleasure.
This can also be seen with Putin wanting to expand Russia's influence beyond its immediate sphere of influence, forging strategic partnerships with countries like China and enforcing ties with other non-Western nations.
Making Russia one of the big players again and scaling the balance of power a little to his favor, a strike against the Western nations.
To add on to that, Putin prioritized maintaining stability and control within Russia, specifically in the face of internal challenges such as economic downturns and opposition movements.
Also, known as consolidating your power via the cracking down on dissent and tightening control over media and civil society. What cannot be seen cannot hurt you.
Let us not forget about the economic impacts of Putin's policy. Putin pursued efforts to diversify the economy and reduce dependence on energy exports. These included initiatives to support small companies and attract foreign investment.
Basically, make Russia an economic power and be not dependent on other nations. A simple strategy that would allow Russia to last out a war if need be. The only issue with that is that if foreign investment ends, Russia will enter into a recession very quickly. Sound familiar?
This can be further proven with how Putin emphasized the importance of modernizing Russia's infrastructure and investing in technological development to drive economic growth and enhance national competitiveness, further proving the point of Russia attempting to become independent in terms of economics.
Don't forget about international isolation from the West. He bolstered Russia's military capabilities, formed more alliances with anyone, and also decided to deal economically less with the West, signs of not being on the same page as the West.
Overall, Putin's new policies from 2016 show how Russia does not want to deal with the West and decides to pursue its personal matters instead, which will lead us to Russia attempting to redo the conflict in Georgia, but instead with Ukraine.
The main course of today's documentary, the conflict with Russia and Ukraine, if you could take it away.
In 2014, Donetsk Oblast was in chaos. Pro-Russian protests, violent clashes instigated by extremist groups, subsequent conflicts exacerbated chaos and uncertainty in the area, made it into an epicenter of significant events in the eastern region.
Protests started on March 6th with the occupation of Donetsk Regional State Administration Building. However, the Ukrainian Security Service intervened quickly and made sure that the protesters left the building.
That was not the end of the protest, as on March 13th, violent clashes erupted between Maidan supporters and separatist groups, resulting in street battles and casualties. A warning for what is about to come.
To carry with that, on April 6, pro-Russian protesters in Donetsk called for an independence referendum, leading to the occupation of the Donetsk Oblast Administration Building by thousands. The Russian flag flew high there, and without the resistance of police, people started to barricade themselves inside.
The very next day, separatist groups threatened to seize control by forming a people's mandate if officials did not hold a special session to announce a referendum on joining Russia.
The Ukrainian government alleged that these actions were part of a destabilization script organized by Russia, and they had all the right to say such things, seeing as the conflicts in Donetsk and its surrounding deepened instability and humanitarian crises.
The protesters demanded to the Kyiv government the following: official status for the Russian language, disarmament of Maidan protesters, and the banning of far-right political organizations, a recipe to make an authoritarian state.
Conflict in Donetsk rapidly escalated in April-May. Government buildings were occupied, clashes between forces ensued, and a general atmosphere of political uncertainty prevailed.
In May, a referendum on autonomy was held in Donetsk Oblast, with a majority voting in favor of autonomy. These results bolstered the legitimacy of separatist groups and deepened the conflict with the Kyiv government. During the conflicts, civilians in the region suffered greatly. Thousands were displaced from their homes and reports of human rights abuses emerged.
The conflicts in Donetsk turned hostile. Government authority in Donetsk lessened, and the separatist group began establishing their own control zones. In the end, the international community made the separatists and Ukraine sign the Minsk Protocol in September 2014, establishing a ceasefire. However, implementing this ceasefire and restoring political stability in the region proved to be a lengthy process, meaning that it wasn't done and swept under the rug immediately.
In the same year, in January, pro-Russian demonstrations began in Odessa. In early March, a pro-Russian rally with approximately 5,000 participants took place in Odessa.
May 2nd is when things took a turn for the worse. A large United Ukraine rally of about 2,000 people was attacked by approximately 300 anti-Maidan militants. The clashes escalated with the exchange of stones, Molotov cocktails, and firearms, specifically their bullets.
Following the clashes, pro-Ukraine protesters moved to dismantle a pro-Russian protest camp at Kulikov Pole. Pro-Russian activists barricaded themselves in the nearby trade union's house. Both exchanged petrol bombs, resulting in the trade union's house catching fire. This tragic event led to the deaths of 48 people, making it one of the bloodiest internal conflicts in the region's history.
Reminder to all of you watching and listening to this that all of this chaos and bloodshed only occurred because a pro-Western president got chosen over the pro-Russian one.
Following the clashes, tension persisted in Odessa. However, with efforts from the international community and local authorities, the situation in the city was brought under control. Nevertheless, political and ethnic tensions continued and long-term solutions for the stability in the region were sought.
international community finally sought their attention to the Ukrainians after the incident in Odessa. However, that would not be the last incident we will be covering in this documentary.
Next along our line of incidents in 2014 is Crimea. On February 27, 2014, unidentified Russian soldiers clandestinely entered Crimea and began seizing strategic points like military bases and government buildings.
The pro-Russian Crimean parliament organized a referendum to determine the status of Crimea. This referendum was to be held to vote on Crimea's accession to Russia. However, the international community and the Ukrainian government stated that the referendum was legal and just a forced show for Russia to expand its influence in the region. The first strike of Russia.
And on March 18, 2014, Russia formally declared the annexation of Crimea, which raised serious concerns in the international community. Ukraine not only lost Crimea but also had to reassess its relations with Russia.
That is strike 2 of Russia, trying to repeat its actions the same way they did in Georgia. This time, however, things would take a different turn for the Russian government.
The third strike was the war in Donbas, a phase of the Russo-Georgian War. Began in April 2014 when Russian-backed separatists seized control of government buildings in several towns and cities in Donetsk Oblast.
Regions like Slovyansk, Mariupol, Horlivka, Kramatorsk and others were taken control over. The conflict escalated as Russia employed a combination of disinformation, irregular fighters and regular troopers to destabilize the region.
Throughout April and May 2014, more towns fell under separatist control, facilitated by the support of Russian volunteers and material.
The Ukrainian government launched a counter-terrorism operation to retake those areas, leading to entrenched standoffs and combat.
However, the conflict in Donbas continued with multiple failed ceasefires and heavy fighting, eventually becoming a frozen conflict.
That said, despite ceasefire agreements like the Minsk Protocol and the Minsk II, violence continued, resulting in thousands of casualties, including civilians, Ukrainian forces, and Russian-backed separatists.
Russia is not pulling any punches, and it shows.
In August 2004, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia escalated dramatically due to significant actions and territorial advancements. That is important.
It started with the invasion of Ukrainian territory by Russian forces, followed by battles in various cities within the Donetsk and Luhansk regions.
Escalation began with a convoy of Russian military vehicles, including armored personnel carriers, going into Ukraine near the Izvarnin border crossing controlled by the insurgents on August 14th.
The Russian Defense Ministry tried to deny it, but evidence emerged confirming the presence of Russian trained combatants among the insurgent forces, meaning that Russia was actively helping and aiding in this war with its military force.
Talk about trying to keep the obvious from coming out.
Subsequently, clashes between Ukrainian and insurgent forces resulted in casualties and destruction, including the downing of a Ukrainian Air Force fighter jet and heavy shelling in cities like Donetsk and Horlivka,
which in turn led to the Ukrainian government forces taking advantage into insurgents-held territories, particularly in Luhansk and Donetsk cities, engaging in street battles and facing resistance.
Later on, reports emerged of Russian military columns entering Ukraine, further complicating the conflict and prompting accusations of direct Russian involvement.
That shows you just how much Russia wants to hide their involvement this time. The reason is because of the international community being more aware of Russia's actions and being more willing to take action against Russia if a situation like Georgia presents itself again. That never happened.
Carry on with the conflict, the month of August saw intense fighting and casualties on both sides, with Ukrainian forces retreating from areas like Novosovsk as pro-Russian forces gained ground.
Here, it also states that despite attempts at negotiation and ceasefire agreements, the conflict persisted, with sporadic violations and continued clashes.
As the year progressed, the conflict persisted, with intermittent attempts at de-escalation and peace talks yielding limited results. The situation remained volatile, with both sides entrenched in their positions and prospects for a lasting resolution seeming increasingly distant.
In the new year of 2015, specifically at New Year's, escalations began again. Numerous ceasefire violations and infighting among insurgent groups started again. The capture of Donetsk International Airport by DPR forces and a deadly ground rocket attack on a civilian bus at a government checkpoint in Buchas. Phew. What a good way to start off the new year.
That led to Ukrainian President Poroshenko accusing Russia of deploying thousands of soldiers and military equipment in the Donbas region. A sensible accusation with all the violence happening immediately in 2015.
That all was attempted to be stopped using the Minsk II agreement, signed on 12th of February 2015, aimed to establish an unconditional ceasefire starting on 15th February.
But I recall that fighting persisted, particularly around the Baltseve, where Ukrainian forces eventually withdrew, ceding control to separatist forces.
Yes, but the conflict entered a stalemate in the end, characterized as a frozen conflict, with occasional outbreaks of fighting and failed ceasefire attempts.
The ceasefire still remained fragile even after it was signed, and that is also carried all the way until 2019.
Oh, 2019. That year was better than 2015 for Ukraine, that's for sure.
That is due to the signing of Steinmeier Formula Agreement in October 2019, outlining steps for reintegration of separatist held territories into Ukraine with special status. This was Ukraine's final attempt at making a ceasefire happen.
Withdrawals of troops and prisoner exchange followed, accompanied by renewed peace talks. A ceasefire in July 2020 brought a temporary reduction in violence, although sporadic violations still occurred.
But it would not stay like that forever. Tensions escalated again in early 2021, marked by increased military movements by Russia near the Ukrainian border. The situation worsened with frequent ceasefire violations and reports of Russian military buildup.
Fighting intensified in Donbas, raising concerns of a potential Russian invasion. In February 2022, Russia recognized the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk, leading to a full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Russian forces encountered heavy resistance, prompting a shift in focus to the Donbas region. The conflict escalated dramatically, drawing condemnation and sanctions from the international community.
And the rest scaled into a full-blown war. But that is all we will cover at the moment.
However, our evidence has shown clearly how Russia was attempting since the 2000s to reclaim post-Soviet territory and how it has succeeded in doing that with Georgia.
Now it is trying to do that with Ukraine, but instead of it being a war that lasted a few days and got them territory, it has turned into a war of many years, which will probably continue to be fought until either Russia backs down or Ukraine surrenders to Russia.
In any case, I hope you enjoyed our documentary, and remember, always make sure to know all the facts before making a claim. Have a good one.